I'm going to start with a short introduction. What is the purpose of ITS in general? You may have heard of ITS 1.0 already. ITS 2.0 tries to cover the whole area of multilingual content production. And for people who are not in this field, they think it may be very simple. Well, you internationalize content, allow for markup like Ruby or directionality, you translate it, and you're done. If you get a bit closer, you see that there are many other aspects to take into account. Like first, the content is created before internationalized. When it's translated, published, but when it's maybe harvested again to train some automatic systems or analyzed. And if you get more closer, there are more processes to take into account, like there are, for example, entities added automatically to the text. So the message of this slide here is bringing content to a different language, or maybe even without translation, working with multilingual content is a process which has a lot of steps. And that process needs help. A very simple example is here. You all know these types of files. Now, if a translator gets such a file, he will have a lot of question marks in his head, like which data element really needs to have the translation. Well, you may solve this by just making a phone call, but ITS is basically about avoiding such phone calls, about that there's no need to manually communicate between content creators and people who work with multilingual processing of the content, but to automatize these kinds of workflows. So ITS 2.0 is meant to help with the situation by providing comprehensive, standardized metadata. Comprehensive means that all these various steps that I mentioned, creating content, enriching it with additional information, localizing it, doing quality checks, and so on, that is taken into account. ITS is standardized, so it's built on ITS 1.0 and enhances this with some features that I'm going to talk about. And it's basically metadata, provide additional information like this translate information I just mentioned. So the basic principles fit on one slide to say important things, say some metadata items about specific content in a standard way. So say something should not be translated, say all selected data elements should not be translated, and do it in an agreed upon syntax and with agreed upon values. So the important things are the metadata items. And one change between ITS 1.0 and 2.0 is that in 1.0 we just had 7 metadata items really focusing on a simple view of how multilingual content is created. Now you have 19 items, which looks rather complex here. I won't go into details. The nice thing is that it's a modular standard, so you can just use one metadata item, process that, and that's fine as well. Now the second part about specific content. It doesn't really work to put all this metadata information everywhere. You need a mechanism to define it just once and process this for various pieces of content. And here ITS deploys an approach similar to CSS. What is called global in ITS, the approach is like the CSS style element. What's local is like the CSS style attribute. So here I have on the slide an example where there is a global so-called ITS rule which uses XPath to select all data elements and then say these are not translatable. So it has the same effect like we had with the local markup here with the ITS translate attribute, but there are two advantages. You just have to write one of these XPath expressions, and the other is that you can do it independent of the content, so you don't have to embed this. One may also use a different selection mechanism like CSS that's not yet implemented, but that may help also to get uptake for web developers, for example. So the third aspect in a standard way. So that means that we define these data categories with predefined values. So say translate has just these two values, yes or no. When we have some specific defaults, so that you don't have to set all metadata items specifically. So say element content is translatable, attribute not. And then to accommodate an ITS 2.0 for HTML5, again, some specific behavior. One example is the alt attribute where we say it's by default translatable. So let me summarize why there was a need to develop ITS 2.0. First, to get to HTML5, because more and more content is created natively here. So there is a need to have such information available. Then to map to other formats. So as I said, multi-linked content production is a workflow, and many other formats play a role. I mentioned in the demo, hopefully, if there's time, you will see the so-called XLIF format, which is widely used in the localization industry, and David Philipp also discussed developments here, which are closely related to ITS yesterday. Then there's also mapping to RDF, so that you can transform this metadata into RDF, and then you could also localize RDF content itself, so if you want to put that into different languages. When there's a mechanism to add traceability information to express what tool actually has produced this ITS metadata, and for the RDF part, there's an ontology defining the RDF representation. Some parts of ITS 1 had to go, directionality and Ruby, and this is just because we wanted to get finished soon. These things are now being defined for HTML5, but just because we want to be finished here, we finalized ITS 2 as a standard. They may be taken up again in a subsequent version. So how does ITS 2 work in HTML5? Well, in the example we had before, and also here on the slide for XML, there is a namespace for ITS. What we do for ITS 2 and HTML5 is to have these ITS hyphen attributes. And coordinated with the colleagues working on HTML and W3C, but this is also understood by the W3C validator by default. So if you validate these files and type, for example, not ITS term equal yes, but forget the S of a yes, you will get a validation error so that people can work with this. So now let me give you some examples of these metadata items. You already heard about translate. You heard about terminology on the previous slide to identify a term. One data category which is not necessarily needed for translation is text analysis. And yesterday, the people who have been at the Oxygen demo session saw how one can generate this markup automatically with Oxygen. Text analysis information is needed to identify concept or names entities in content. Well, for what purposes? One purpose is translation. So imagine there's the string Armstrong in the text, where dozens of meanings what Armstrong can be, and a translator can save a lot of time to have disambiguation here. How does this look like? You first have here an TA ident_ref attribute that identifies the concept in question, then a class ref attribute that identifies the type of the concept, here a movie, and then auto-generated by the tool a confidence marker, saying I have a confidence of 0.7. Another example, domain information. So this metadata is not meant to identify a closed list of domain items, because everybody has its own domain items, but rather to map domain items or identifiers from existing content to the workflow. So in existing web content especially, you have a lot of such items. So the reason is search engine optimization. People put a lot of metadata to say, my page is about travel and travel to Prague and travel to XMLPrague and so on. But if you have the scenario to translate this stuff automatically, then you need to choose a machine translation which is maybe just adapted to travel and to nothing else. So you need to map these general lots of items to with one or two more specific items needed for the machine translation system. And that's done here with this domain metadata. You said everything which is in the body of a document selected by the selector attribute. For this, there's existing domain information that's identified with a domain pointer, and that should be mapped to the more general definition needed for machine translation. That's identified with a domain mapping. So coming again to machine translation, after the output of machine translation, there's also a metadata item which can be generated to give the score of a machine translation system. So here on the slide you see an HTML fragment where we assume that well, this translation has been made here. Dublin is the capital of Ireland. And then there's the empty confidence attribute saying the tool is 0.89 something confident that this is a correct translation. So such kind of confidence information, or also the information about generating concepts, that's tool specific. There's no interoperability to say tool A created a value 0.5 and tool A created 0.6, so tool B is better. It's really tool dependent, so this kind of confidence information is only understandable if there's a trace of the tool. So that's why here you see the ITS annotators ref attribute, which gives you the trace, the tool identifier for this metadata. So these were just some examples of how this all works. Most of the effort when this was created, this was funded by a European project, the effort, the standardization effort, went actually not in the standardization itself, but in tooling. So I already mentioned the support in the W3C validator. When there's a round tripping to go from XML content to HTML5 content, so to map the namespaces to the hyphen attributes, whereas what you see is what you get editing support in various systems, now Oxygen and various other editors, also outside the HTML or XML realm. There are auto-generation services who create the text analysis markup or terminology information. There's format conversion if you have this content in DocBook and go to HTML, but metadata is preserved, and lots of other implementations. And one I'm going to demo soon in the realm of localization workflows. If you want to see this in action, there's also now a video channel that we had set up. Just search for ITS 2.0 videos, and you will see some examples, and there's a wiki page documenting here these implementations. And it seems there is enough time for a demo, so I'm just going to try that with the Okapi tool. What am I processing? I'm processing an HTML5 file here, and what is here now in yellow, that's content that should be translated in the whole process. The other parts of the document should not be translated. And there's now some ITS metadata embedded here to make that clear. Since in HTML you cannot as is script XML, it's embedded here in, you cannot process XML as is normally, it's embedded here in the script element where this works. And you have here first a translate specification which says all these table cells which have the proper class should be translated, the rest should not be translated. Then, that's then important for the quality check. There's a rule saying each field should not be more than 30 bytes long. And then there's this domain mapping that I had mentioned before. So in the original content, it's talking about vacation packages. In the machine translation system, that system just knows about travel, nothing else. So I'm now opening this Okapi tool, and here is this HTML file loaded. And if you go now here to the pipeline view, you see here what's happening now is that first the document will be segmented. That also takes some default HTML5 segmentation rules into account. Some translation memory will be applied, which is on this machine, but that does not rely on metadata. Then there's a call of Microsoft machine translation, Microsoft Hub machine translation service. So that's not the usual Bing translator, but a service which is provided where companies on its own can have their systems. And Okapi here has its system. Its system there is a travel sub-engine on that system. And that call here maps the existing definition of these various types of travel using the ITS metadata to this engine. And the main point here is that here you don't see anything mentioned of travel. So you just need to set up this here once, this setting, and then all this mapping happens automatically. Then here's the quality check, which takes the byte length into account, and then there's the XLIF file created. So I hope that this now is going to work. Looks like, yes, it looks good. So closing some windows here. So now in the directory, we have this translation kit here generated. There's a work directory, and there's an HTML5 XLIF file. And that XLIF file is a bytext format, which contains the original text and the translated text. And you see here that embedded here is information also about the domain. And the domain is just the travel domain. It's not the various more detailed types which had been in the original content, but via the domain mapping, this information here has been generalized to what the machine translation engine understands. And you see also that some machine translation engine happened here. So here's some French content generated. And now there are some examples here where the quality check happened. So here you see on this element that there's the storage size information, but the output of a machine translation is too long. So there's an auto-generated comment that the number of bytes is too long, should have been smaller. 30 is allowed by the ITS specification, but the length is 42. So for the quality check, what you see here is not really readable, but there's also an HTML generation which gives a nicer overview that people can then work with this material. And there's also other tools which allow people then to edit so that the quality is improved. And the main point here is really this, let me bring that up again, that using this metadata, you have to set up such a pipeline like I just executed here just once. And then all this interplay between the existing domain data and the machine translation to choose and the quality checking and so on, that happens automatically because the ITS metadata kind of connects the various steps in the workflow. So that was one demo of the Okapi-based Rainbow tool. So what's coming next? So ITS is now finished. It's a final standard, but people are working on more usage scenarios, on also more implementations. In the ITS interest group, so not a standardization forum, but a forum to gather feedback, which is free to join. And also the work related to the linked data aspect that I had mentioned here and that I had mentioned also yesterday in the analytics session that I worked on in other W3C community groups related to linked open data and to language technology and linked data. And that's it. And with that, thank you very much.
So we have space for questions. It seems that Ethereum is only interested how to translate coffee into the various languages like café, ristretto. There is a question from Jim.
Thank you for that. What do you see your biggest challenge for adoption of something like this? Is it building into the tools, or is it communicating the message to groups?
I see the hardest challenge to convince the people who have to produce that metadata to have to make use of it, to convince them to have a value. So people who work on tools used for content production, like people in this room, people who pay these people that their content is produced, they don't have an immediate benefit of this metadata. The benefit is then more that the localization and translation, creation of multilingual content is smoother than without it. So normally these are, even in one company, separate departments. And the people who create the content, they don't necessarily care about these other steps where performance measures are not related to how fast is the stuff translated. That's somebody else. So it's a bit a chicken and egg problem, but I think if there is more also automatic tool support of this XPath approach, for example, of auto-generation of markup, then it can be easier for the content producers to work with that, and then the burden is not so high to create metadata.
Thank you. I will just add, maybe Felix mentioned it during the talk, that some data categories like Translate are already supported by tools like Google Translate or Microsoft Translator. So if you use them in HTML markup, some parts of the document doesn't have to be translated if they don't have to be. Okay?
Yeah,
more questions? No, then Felix, thank you again. And
thank you.